Hello, everyone, and welcome to this lecture on decolonizing the classroom for Gender Studies 2001, Decolonizing Gender. I am your instructor, but I would hope to be less of a sort of colonial instructor presence and more of a, guide or someone who can kind of help us along. Dr. Jason Coe, you can just call me Jason, or my colonial name, Dr. Jason Coe, I guess, or anyway, yeah, that joke didn't go well. Okay, let's keep going. All right, so decolonizing the classroom. So those of you who were not able to attend our first class, I'm going to sort of recap what we talked about in that class and sort of explain to you why I'm trying to use a different type of teaching and a different type of structure for this class. And hopefully that will become kind of clear to you as we kind of go through this lecture. Of course, I was really hoping to not be doing this kind of lecture style because, to me, that's also part of the kind of colonial system. But, we have to make do with what we've got. So let's do that, and then we can kind of brainstorm. Ideally, we would be brainstorming together about how to kind of work against that. All right, so let's start with some definitions. So you're all, many of you have taken gender studies courses, and you understand that this notion of gender is something that, we're trying to examine how it is constructed, how it influences society, and how, and different ways of studying gender as a sort of category of analysis, okay? But this other term, decolonizing, is maybe something that's new to you, all right? So for this lecture, I'm going to focus on this notion of decolonizing first, okay? So what is decolonization? So decolonization is a process of revealing and dismantling colonialist power in all its forms. Okay. This includes dismantling the hidden aspects of those institutional and cultural forces that had maintained the colonialist power and that remain even after political independence is achieved. Okay, so colonialism. So we need to talk about this in terms of colonialism first. Okay, colonialism, as you probably should know by now, is a sort of process of empires taking over other places and instituting rule over those places and the people there. Okay, so this is a very, very basic, explanation, but this is, a process that started, has been going on. Okay, you could say that colonialism has been going on for all of human history. Okay, whether that's the Greeks and the Romans, or the what's his name, like Qin Shi Huang, and the Qing Emperor, but usually when we're talking about colonialism, we're talking about it in terms of modern colonialism, starting out in the age of, what the Europeans call the age of exploration, where you start to have, colonial powers. Well, there weren't powers until they started colonizing, but the power of the empire, or the ability to become an empire, extends from this ability to travel to these other places, with military soldiers, and take over and take resources, and sometimes build up institutions for governance. And these are very, very, very long processes. Okay, so the process of colonization is not something that happens overnight. It's not something that just, it's like, oh, one place takes over another and that's it. Colonialism is something that happens, through a lot of different processes, including, what we take for granted today, like, the process of, building infrastructure and setting up governments and creating educational institutions, etc. Okay, so then the process of decolonization then is to kind of reveal and dismantle, okay, what kind of institutions, not just institutions, but as they're saying, in all its forms, these forms that kind of enforce that colonial power. Okay, and this is what the focus is on hidden aspects. Okay, so when it comes to the fields that I kind of did my research in, such as literary and cultural studies, film studies, decolonization is very, very far our kind of experience with decolonization is very, very far down the line. Okay, an experience of decolonization, very upstream, you could say, would be someone who, takes part in, freedom fighting or something like that. Someone who, buys a gun and, a colonized or indigenous person who takes up a gun and starts to fight, against an invading army or something like that. For the work that we do, downstream, all the way downstream, is analyzing, the kind of institutional aspects of that, such as education, such as language, etc. Okay, so let's talk more specifics. What are sort of institutions that have been or need to be decolonized? So obviously upstream, right? The first kind of level of resistance is things like let's say you have like a guard station or something, run by some like a colonial military or something like that, taking, trying to undermine that so that it can no longer guard people. But, colonialism is something that happens for such a long time that, and over such, and through successive generations, that its institutions are really the institutions that we use every single day. So for example, I think the most important example that we're going to focus on today is the University of Hong Kong itself is a colonial institution that was used to enforce British hegemony, and also kind of create a class of people who consider themselves to be part of that colonial group. And these institutions are used to enforce things like language. Okay, so one very important aspect of colonialism is language itself. Right now this lecture takes place in English. We are learning in an English language environment. Your assignments will all be done in English. But, indigenous people to a certain location, English is a foreign language. And yet at the same time, it's been something that's so instituted that it's hard to say that it's not, how do you kind of dismantle that, okay, so we're going to focus on education. But one thing that I like to think about is, like, for example, my grandparents, lived in Taiwan, and during the early 1900s, and their ancestors, actually moved to Taiwan in the 1800s, and so you could say that they were colonized by the Japanese. Okay, they were Qing subjects, and they went to Japan. They went to Taiwan, and then Taiwan was ceded to Japan in a war, right? And then Japan colonized Taiwan. And our understanding of modern Taiwan today, a lot of it is because of, the Japanese infrastructure that they built in, whether that's railroads, that's industries, that's cities themselves. Okay, so you can see that as a form of colonialism. So my grandparents, when they were in school, even though their sort of native language was Taiwanese, they would get in trouble at school if they spoke Taiwanese. So they would have to speak Japanese. So you can see that as a sort of colonial kind of institution. And so even today, well, my grandparents just passed away, but even 10 years ago, I guess, they actually spoke much better Japanese than they did Mandarin, okay, which many might consider to be a native language for them, but it wasn't. And then so when my mother was in school in Taiwan, if she spoke Taiwanese, or Hokkien, if you want to say, although there are differentiations between these, at school, she also would get in trouble, and they would teach her to speak Mandarin. So my mother, her kind of like, like her academic language, you could say, would be Mandarin, although she also speaks excellent English. But then when she's at home with her family, she likes to speak Taiwanese. It might be very similar for you. Your academic and your institutional language might be English, but maybe at home you speak Cantonese. Yet at the same time, okay, and here's where it gets kind of iffy or strange, right, is do we really consider, like if my mother or my grandparents decide to speak Taiwanese, is this a decolonizing movement? Because and we'll talk more about this later, the kind of what people call like Bendi, right? This is like the native people of, native Chinese or whatever of Taiwan, are not actually, native, right? There are actually, there was a very big native indigenous population who are, in the sense, colonized by people like my grandparents and my mother. So even though the Taiwanese may have achieved independence from the Japanese, and they might consider that a decolonial move, aren't they still sort of for the indigenous of Taiwan, for them, it would be considered still a colonizing move. Okay, so that's why there's this focus on the hidden aspects of institutional cultural forces. Okay, and another thing that's very, very important to understand too is that this notion of a nation state, this idea that there's such thing as a nation where people are held together and it has like a military and there's a national language, this itself is a colonial thing. You don't have what we would call modern day nationalism, and modern globalization without colonialism. In fact, a lot of the structures that are used to govern, whether even something like the UN, is something that's born out of colonialist necessity. Okay, a lot of the bureaucratic structures, the technology of governance itself is something that comes out of colonial history. So, why is it that British liberalism succeeded all throughout the British Empire? A lot of it is because a lot of it was developed and learned in its colonies, like Hong Kong or in British India. Okay, so it's very hard to extract oneself from these colonial institutions. Okay, and so why do they remain after independence? Well, even this notion of being an independent nation is sort of a vestige of colonialism. How do you know what it is to be an independent nation when before colonialism you had tribes and kingdoms and villages, and there wasn't this sense of we are a nation that's independent? Okay, so it's very hard to extract ourselves from that thinking, which is why there's kind of this argument about like, how do you decolonize your mind, right? How do you change the way that you think about something if it's been kind of born out of colonialism? Okay, and even this idea of a Hong Konger or a Hong Kong identity is very much developed because of colonialism. There's no Hong Kong without the British Empire and its colonial aspects. And if we talk about how it is to decolonize Hong Kong, like even the word Hong Kong cannot be decolonized. I think that's the point, right? So even today, then, even though many places are independent, right? Why is it that decolonization still needs to happen? So this is very, very downstream, right? A lot of the decolonizing movements began after World War II, okay? But why is it that decolonization still happens, right? So the globalization of the modern world economy, okay, so has meant that political independence has not affected the kinds of changes in economic and cultural control that the early nationalists might have expected. It has even been argued by some recent commentators that the colonial powers deliberately avoided granting independence until they had, through internal discriminations and hegemonic educational practices, created an elite comprador, okay, that's the kind of word they use, class to maintain aspects of colonial control on their behalf, but without the cost or the opprobrium. So opprobrium means kind of like castigation. It means to throw shade. Okay, that's our modern terminology, right? Opprobrium is when you throw shade on someone. It's like shaming them or telling them that they're bad. Okay, associated with the classic colonial models. So the argument that Ashcroft and others are making is that even today, colonialism still exists because of our global economy. So even though you have places that are basically independent in terms of politics, because of this kind of like institutionalization of a comprador class of economic systems, they still benefit the empire, and they still are forms of colonialism, or what some people call neo-colonialism. Okay, so for example, right, the United States, right, the empire of North America and much of the Pacific, even though it doesn't technically kind of like own or kind of like have political control over many places throughout South America and Latin America, these places are in fact, very much, in effect, colonies, because all of their kind of politics are still dictated by people who have very close relations to the United States, especially with regards to business and big economic things like corporations. They're dependent upon American military control, and a lot of money that goes back and forth. This is also true of like Taiwan, for example. Some people will say that Taiwan is like, I've read studies that say Taiwan is effectively the 51st state of the United States, because it even though it's technically independent, although many will argue with that. Okay, so it's technically not independent. I don't know, whatever. Okay, it still is like an American military base in a lot of ways. It still, functions as a colony, even though it's technically not. So globalization has made it so places can effectively function as colonies, even though they're not technically colonies. Okay, so that's why you still need to decolonize, because these, what do they call, hidden aspects of institutional cultural forces still maintain power and hegemony. And a big part of that is because there are people who are part of this elite comprador class that maintain aspects of colonial control. Okay, and this elite comprador class also benefits from that. So, confession time or whatever, but like, I am part of that elite comprador class. So is my family. My family comes from Taiwan, and, a lot of them were educated in the United States. We moved to the United States, and we export and import, whether that's goods or education or ideas. So many people might consider me to be a part of that colonial force because I'm a native English speaker. I live in a place like Hong Kong where I'm teaching these Western ideas, in order so that you can also become part of that comprador class. Okay, so many people might consider, me to be a product of colonialism. And even if I teach a class called Decolonizing Gender, I'm still enacting colonialism. Okay, and so this is an important part of the tension built into, understanding decolonization that we have to grapple with in this course. I'm not saying that it's something that we can never get away from, but at the same time, I'm also not saying that we should give up. Okay, and this is what I think it's still important to pursue and understand. But that's kind of something that scholars and academics and activists, and people will still have to grapple with their whole lives and think about. Okay, what's my responsibility within this kind of system? Okay, because colonialism has really greatly benefited someone like people like in my family who have, really benefited from American imperial hegemony, in the Pacific, but has negatively affected, obviously, the indigenous of Taiwan, as well as, places like Vietnam, Cambodia. Okay, so it's very important to acknowledge that tension and understand our kind of role within it before we throw around these words like decolonization. And even this notion that you can decolonize your mind is, we'll talk more about that later. Okay, all right, so. Obviously, education is a really, really big part of this. This is also from the Ashcroft reading, as well as direct and indirect economic control, the continuing influence of Eurocentric cultural models. Okay, so our system, our university system, is a Eurocentric cultural model. Okay, have no doubt about it. Okay, privileged the imported over the indigenous. So, most of your teachers at HKU are educated elsewhere. They're educated in the United States or in, Australia or in the UK, okay? And colonial languages over local languages, okay? So like English, for example, over local languages. Here you could say a local language is Cantonese, but, if there are, any remnants of people who might be considered indigenous to Hong Kong, Cantonese is also, an imported language, okay? So another thing is writing over orality and linguistic culture over inscriptive cultures of other kinds, like dance, graphic arts, which have been designated as folk culture. Okay, so in our current, educational university institution, you have to write a lot of papers, and that's designated as being worthwhile and valuable, and you need to be trained in doing that. Okay, and being, stronger in English. Okay, and it of course, it benefits you in the economic system, but the economic system itself, right, of, liberal capitalism is a colonial institution. Okay, so against all these occlusions and overridings of pre-colonial cultural practices, a number of programs of decolonization have been attempted. Notable among these have been those that seek to revive and revalue local languages. The pressure of the global economy means that elite communication is dominated by the use of ex-colonial languages, notably the New World language of English, whose power derives from its historical use across the largest of the modern empires and from its use by the United States. Okay. So even language, is a colonial institution, though the language that we're practicing this in. Okay. And unfortunately, first of all, my Cantonese is non-existent. My Mandarin is okay, but my reading of Chinese would not be, good enough that you could write papers in it and I could evaluate them fairly. Okay. All right. So here's a question then. Can Hong Kong be pre-colonial? Okay. So on a very, very basic level, and we can work down through all of this, but on a very basic level, without British colonialism, there's no such thing as Hong Kong. Hong Kong, had some people living there before, and okay, this is important for you to study the history, okay? Because there are some arguments that Hong Kong was just a rock before the British came in, okay? But there were fishing villages and other things, and the more history that they study, the more they find about Hong Kong before the British came in. Okay, so those of you who are interested in that, you may want to do a study of that, But secondly, language. Can you have a pre-colonial language for Hong Kong? Okay, some might argue Cantonese, but is it something that's indigenous to Hong Kong? Is that even possible? Okay, economics. Okay, well, first of all, the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the U.S. dollar. Okay, and even then, our economic system is built on liberal capitalism. And also, it's like, how do you even envision an economic system that has not been influenced by colonialism? Even socialism, right, is also an import, right, from Germany, and then and so I've read arguments from indigenous Americans who talk about how socialism and capitalism are two sides of the same colonialist, modernist, modern colonialist kind of imperial aggression. Even our term, this idea that there being economy, why does there have to be an economy? Why does it have to function this way? That it in itself is a sort of colonizing apparatus. So how do you make it pre-colonial? Okay, politics. Yeah, this idea of having a chief executive where you have someone who runs the city, that is a colonial institution. Okay, let's say Hong Kong did become, fully democratic and, whatever. That's also, like democracy, and the way that it's instituted around the world and oftentimes forced upon people is itself, like a colonial institution. The greatest empire in the world right now is a democracy, right? The United States is the world's greatest empire, but when I say greatest, I mean like strongest. Okay, I don't mean like good, but that's whatever. Okay, is a democracy and uses democracy, and so was Rome. Okay, so religion, right? So oftentimes religion, such as whether that's Christianity, Catholicism, or you could even say Buddhism or Taoism. Okay, is brought about and instituted through colonizing apparatuses. Okay, how many of you went to a school that either used the term saint, had saint in it, like saint something? Okay, these Catholic or Jesuit sort of institutions are very important to the colonial apparatus, and religion was often used to justify colonialism, especially during the Age of Exploration. If you look at the Spanish Empire, oftentimes the justification for going to these colonies, which have tons of silver and gold, and tons of arable land for growing crops, was, oh, we want to go there to civilize the natives and teach them, about religion, and so it's like religion gets used to justify. So it's a very thorny question if you are asking yourself, can I see myself as someone who is, a believer in, whatever religion, and even Islam, right? Islam can also be seen as a colonizing religion, or Hinduism. Okay, so these thinking of oneself as both a believer in a certain religion and yet acknowledging the colonial kind of conventions that instituted that religion is something to grapple with and understand. Okay, society, family, how do people live? How did people live? The way that we live today, our current structure, in Hong Kong, obviously is a remnant of British colonialism. But what about the family? What about this idea that, you live in a small apartment, mommy, daddy, okay, in this heteronormative way, of a heteronormative family structure of, parents and children in this nuclear family, right? Did people always live that way? Is this something that was instituted in a colonial way, right? And this is supposed to be, I think that the original intention for this course was to examine this specifically. How is it that issues of family and gender, and gender constructions, and the kind of, the way that colonial institutions created our sense of gender. Okay, and I will cover that in another lecture next week. Okay, but at the same time, what I'm trying to say, though, is using this term decolonize or thinking about it as pre-colonial is very complicated and something we have to think through. Okay, so a very important essay that came out recently is one that says decolonization is not a metaphor. Okay, so I ask you to read that. Okay, and so what they're saying is decolonization is not the new social justice. Okay, you can't use the term decolonization in the same breath that we use like human rights activism or anti-discrimination or gender parity or diversity. They're not the same thing. And if you use decolonization within that term, you're kind of eliminating something that's very, very important and kind of getting it sucked in, because it's very important to think about it like this. It's like part of decolonization could be, or how do I put this? Efforts towards social justice could also be colonizing. A really great example of this is in Iran with the Taliban. Okay, so a lot of people justified American incursions into Afghanistan because they said, "Oh, the Taliban is, oppressing women." And I'm not saying that wasn't happening. Okay, and that definitely happens, right? But a lot of colonialism is justified by this kind of sense that you have. And I'll write this, okay? Is a lot of colonialism is justified by, arguments of, this kind of white men saving brown women from brown men, okay? So we'll talk. I would like to do a lecture on this, but that's from Gayatri Spivak, okay? And she talks about it in her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Okay. Now, basically, what I'm trying to say here is that something like what we would consider to be social justice and gender parity can also be a colonizing force and used to justify colonialism. Okay, so if someone is like, oh, the Taliban is doing these terrible things to the women in Afghanistan, well, then we need to go in there and bomb. This is what people during the 2000s actually said is, quote, bomb them back to the Stone Age. It's like there needs to be some sort of, justice for these people. And so we're going to then colonize, right? So social justice, and this is not always true, and I would like to think most of the time it's not true at all, but social justice projects can themselves be colonizing. Okay? So it's very important to separate this term decolonization from what people think is like, diversity initiatives or social justice initiatives. Okay, so this is what Tuck and Yang say. One trend we have noticed with growing apprehension, and they're both scholars who work on settler colonialism. So settler colonialism is like what I was talking about before, like Qing era people from China migrating to Taiwan and then taking over and then becoming kind of settlers, or what many Americans, Anglo-American, European Americans did in the United States or in Australia or in Canada, where they go there, they settle, and they kind of become colonialists. Okay, all right, and then colonize the indigenous. Okay, and this is a generalization, but it's also very likely to be true. But most of the people who are listening to this lecture, who are in this class, are probably in some form settler colonials. Okay. Like, I definitely come from a settler colonial family. There's no getting around that, okay? All right, so one trend we have noticed with growing apprehension is the ease with which the language of decolonization has been superficially adopted into education and other social sciences, supplanting prior ways of talking about social justice, critical methodologies, or approaches which decenter social settler perspectives. So this is keys. Decentering and decolonization is not the same thing, okay? Decolonization, which we assert is a distinct project from other civil and human rights-based social justice projects, is far too often subsumed into the directives of these projects, with no regard for how decolonization wants something different than those forms of justice. Settler scholars, so I guess that's me, swap out prior civil and human rights-based terms, seemingly to signal both an awareness of the significance of the indigenous and decolonizing theorizations of schooling and educational research, and to include indigenous peoples on the list of considerations as an additional special ethnic group or class. So by calling it decolonizing, then you're like, okay, so I've incorporated the indigenous into this, and they say that that's wrong. That's not what it is. Okay, so how can you decolonize without And a lot of this work on decolonizing, they say, does not include indigenous voices. So at a conference on educational research, it is not uncommon to hear speakers refer almost casually to the needs to, quote, decolonize our schools, or use decolonizing methods, or decolonize student thinking. Yet, we have observed a startling number of these discussions make no mention of indigenous peoples, our and / their struggles for the recognition of our / their sovereignty, or the contributions of indigenous intellectuals and activists to theories and frameworks of decolonization. Further, there is often little recognition given to the immediate context of settler colonialism on the North American lands where many of these conferences take place. Okay? So, if you use this term decolonization, but then you're not even bringing indigenous people into this conversation, it's not decolonization. So decolonization is not a metaphor. So what is a metaphor? Okay, let's Google a definition so we get an idea. Okay, just to be clear, metaphor. Okay, a metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is not applied to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. Okay. Usually, the way I think that we use it mostly is something that's regarded as representative or symbolic of something else. So if you think of decolonization as a metaphor, that's what when people say it's like decolonize your mind. Okay, that's using it as a metaphor. You're not literally decolonizing your mind. And in fact, I think the point is that there is no literal way to decolonize your mind. There is only, so when people say decolonization is a metaphor, it's using it in a non-literal way. It's like, oh, kind of enact this process of uncovering these kind of cultural forces within yourself or within your institution and taking it out. But they're saying it's decolonization, not a metaphor. Decolonization is a literal process of actually this kind of like, taking apart this institution, taking apart this type of thing. Okay? It's a literal process of divesting power from colonizing apparatuses and restoring power to the indigenous. So you're not decolonizing unless you're taking power away from a colonial institution, even one that you've inherited as a settler colonial, for example, and restoring it to the indigenous. So I'll read what they say. Okay? We want to be sure to clarify that decolonization is not a metaphor. When metaphor invades decolonization, it kills the very possibility of decolonization. It recenters whiteness, it resettles theory, it extends innocence to the settler, it entertains a settler future. Decolonize, a verb, and decolonization, a noun, cannot easily be grafted onto pre-existing discourses / frameworks, even if they are critical, even if they are anti-racist, even if they are justice frameworks. The easy absorption, adoption, and transposing of decolonization is yet another form of settler appropriation. When we write about decolonization, we are not offering it as a metaphor. It is not an approximation of other experiences of oppression. Decolonization is not a swappable term for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. Decolonization does not have a synonym. Okay? So when we think about this in terms of gender then, how can you decolonize gender? So to literally decolonize gender would be to literally take apart the power, of the colonial apparatus of gender and give that power to the indigenous. How do you do that? Okay, and if we do it in a classroom, is that something we're really doing? Okay, and I think that the original intention when we kind of created the title for this course, Decolonizing Gender, okay, was to kind of think about gender as something that has been a colonial institution. Okay, and that I think that and to understand that process of how that works, right? How is it that gender kind of gets instituted? But at the same time, if you call it decolonizing gender, how is it that we are giving power back to the indigenous? Are we decolonizing gender literally? Okay, so that's the tough question. Right? So that's something that I grappled with immediately when I started doing the research for this course. Okay. So, and I think that some scholars and, academics and teachers might, and I think I'm a part of this group too, who think that, if I work towards social justice, if I work towards, these kind of things, I'm trying to kind of do things that are good, okay, that make education and, better. But at the same time, people who like Tuck and Yang, for example, would say that this is just another form of settler apologetics, where I'm just like doing things to apologize for my privilege. Okay, I think they have a point here. Okay, but here they say clearly we are advocates for the analysis of settler colonialism within education and education research. We position the work of indigenous thinkers as central in unlocking the confounding aspects of public schooling. We, at least in part, want others to join us in these efforts, so that settler colonial structuring and indigenous critiques of that structuring are no longer rendered invisible. Yet this joining cannot be too easy, too open, too settled. Solidarity is an uneasy, reserved, and unsettled manner that neither reconciles present grievances nor forecloses future conflict. There are parts of the decolonization project that are not easily absorbed by human rights or civil rights-based approaches to educational equity. In this essay, we think about what decolonization wants. So when it comes to what decolonization wants, would you really want a male cisgendered settler colonial like myself, native English speaker, American citizen, to be teaching a course on decolonizing gender? And I think that that's what they're saying is it's not that you cannot do that. It's that I cannot take that for granted, that I'm still taking part in that. Okay, it needs to be unsettled. Okay, so I'm taking that unsettlement to heart. Okay, saying that I should not be comfortable in my position as your lecturer, as your teacher. That I need to kind of think about what is it that I'm doing. Okay, so our Hong Kongers settler colonialists. Okay. And this goes back more into that. Okay, so I'll talk more about this one more time. Okay, so there's a long and bumbled history of non-indigenous peoples making moves to alleviate the impacts of colonization. The too easy adoption of decolonizing discourses, making decolonization a metaphor, is just one part of that history, and it taps into pre-existing tropes that get in the way of more meaningful potential alliances. I think this is a really great example of this is like a Taiwanese independence movement, where they say it's like, we are independent from China, don't enforce that upon us. And yet at the same time, and they're saying like, China is trying to colonize us, PRC is trying to colonize us. But it's like, how can you use that terminology when you in fact are a settler colonial and the indigenous people of Taiwan have been colonized by you, the Japanese, and so on and so forth, okay? So they're saying is we think of the enactment of these tropes as a series of moves to innocence, quote unquote, right? Or like trying to alleviate guilt, which problematically attempt to reconcile settler guilt and complicity and rescue settler futurity. Okay, so rescue settler futurity is also in the sense is like make room for yourself in the future. Okay, and yeah, I think that many Taiwanese independence, movement people, they need to think about the role of, the indigenous and how, this kind of argument that they're decolonizing themselves, or decolonizing that structure is also, like when they speak Taiwanese instead of Mandarin or something like that they're still, worried more about themselves than the actual decolonial project. And that's why they want to take away this term decolonization. Okay, so there's settler nativism, these are examples that they talk, right? Settler nativism, so when a settler thinks of themselves as native, right? So it's like, that's like Han Taiwanese saying like, I'm native to Taiwan. It's like, no, you're not. Okay, fantasizing adoption, it's like, I can become more indigenous by, like, I don't know, watching movies about indigenous people, something like that. Colonial equivocation, saying like, I'm not as bad as the colonizer. The Japanese were much worse. The KMT was much worse. Okay, conscientization. It's like, I have a conscience. Asterisk indigenous peoples and reoccupation and urban homesteading. Okay, all right. So what they're saying is basically decolonization ends up being a sort of a move towards colonialism still, especially if you use it as a metaphor and you don't literally, find ways to give power back to the indigenous. So that's not something that I don't know that we can really do in this course, and I think we kind of have to face that. We can understand the history of colonialism, but whether or not we're actually decolonizing, I think it really is under question. So I would feel much more comfortable to think about this course, Decolonizing Gender, as a question. Decolonizing gender? Are we doing that? Can we do that? Okay. All right. So one kind of thing that was written as response to this by this scholar Appleton is to say, instead of using the word decolonize, right, try to use other D words, okay, that will help in terms of social justice without trying to claim this term that you're decolonized, right? So one is diversify your syllabus and curriculum. So, like, don't just teach the canon. Don't just teach what always gets taught, right? So digress from the canon. Move away from it. Okay, so, and what's interesting is this course, Decolonizing Gender, is itself an attempt to diversify the syllabus and the curriculum. You're saying, like, how can we, the main kind of goal is to study what people outside of the Euro-American kind of canon have to say about gender, So it's like, every gender studies program studies Judith Butler or something like that, and and Simone de Beauvoir. They're saying it's like, at least when we originally conceived of this course, it was like, okay, well then let's diversify from that. Find, Asian scholars who talk about gender, local, Hong Kong, But at the same time, it's like, can you really call that decolonizing? Especially if we're going to read it all in English, okay? Secondly is digress from the canon. So let's find other works, okay? Decenter knowledge and knowledge production, and this is key, okay? So right now, the current institutional setup is I am the teacher and I give knowledge to you. Right? I find the knowledge, or I know the knowledge, okay, and I produce it and I generate and I send it to you. So it's like a top-down model, right? A hierarchy, okay? And instead of doing that, let's decenter it. So the goal is to kind of create different forms of producing knowledge, one that I'm working with you, okay? So we're devaluing the hierarchy too. So it's like it shouldn't just be about what it is that me as your teacher can do, okay? Like a hierarchy is, where you have like a set structure of one on top of the other. Okay, so we're trying to devalue that. So instead of thinking of, Dr. Ko is a teacher, it's like, I can also be a student. Okay, I can work with you, and I can learn from you. Of course, and of course I have things to learn from you. Okay, and then disinvest from citational power structures. So this is more of a scholarship kind of thing, but like don't always quote the same person, the same people who are already in power and who are, built up by colonial institutions. Like, for example, right, one of the strongest, educational institutions in the United States, like Duke University, okay, and Duke is built on slave land, okay, and all of North Carolina is built through kind of slave tobacco, okay. So it's like every time we cite like Duke University Press or something like that, we are kind of supporting a colonial institution. So they're saying disinvest from that citational power structure. Another thing is diminish some voices and opinion in meetings while magnifying others, okay. So one is I need to diminish my own voice, and I need to magnify yours. So how do I do that? Okay, and it's tough, right? I'm trying to get you guys to work in these forums, and ask you to articulate your opinions, but it's tough, right? Okay, so let's see what we can do. All right, so that is why we're doing this current structure for the course. Okay, what am I doing? Right, Moodle. Okay. Close this, Moodle. Okay, so that's why I want you to take part in the organization of this. So we can't really decolonize our classroom, but we can try to do our best to do all these other D terms, right? What is it? Okay, let's get it again, okay? Or actually, I put it in here, didn't I? I did. Diversify, digress, decenter, devalue, disinvest, diminish, okay? So I want you to, okay, but in order to do that, then you also need to take responsibility, right? So, like, colonialism is not just like one group or one institution enforces its power over others. Others have to kind of give up their power too, okay? And sometimes that's easier, right? I know that like when I'm with my mom, who's very authoritative, and sometimes it's just better to just let her have control. It's easier for me, right? And I get to just do less because as long as she's doing things her way, more gets done, right? And then it's easier, right? But it can't be that way in this class where you just have me do everything, okay? And then just kind of listen to the lectures and follow along. You need to take responsibility too. If we aren't going to decolonize the classroom, but we are going to try to go along this process of diversifying, digressing, decentering, devaluing, disinvesting, and diminishing, okay? So you need to take responsibility as well, all right? So that's why I'm asking you to come up with potential topics for the course, okay? So let's get into some logistics now, all right? So first of all, right now, our in-person classes have been canceled for February 6th and February 13th. But what I'll do is I will kind of, I'm going to do a video lecture. And there's still the possibility that next week we could do a Zoom conference meeting where I talk with you and we meet in person or over the internet. So there's a vote for that right now. So if you want to do that, vote yes. If you don't want to vote, do it, vote no. Okay? And if you have no preference, click no preference. Okay, back to what we're talking about. Yeah, okay. Secondly, I want you to take part in this discussion about what we should be studying. Okay, not only what we should be studying, but also how you should be assessed. Okay, so let's look at the sort of list. All right, so I'm asking you to kind of separate it out, but it's kind of tough. I know that these forms may be a bit outdated comparatively. All right, but let's take a look. Okay, so here are the nominated topics. So I'm going to talk about these topics here. Okay, but I also want you to kind of get into the forums and talk about maybe why you might want it or not. Okay, and then what we'll do is after February 13th, I'll put up a poll, and then during that poll, we will decide. Okay, what we're going to study for the rest of the semester. Okay, and then I'll find the readings for us and the texts. Okay, but you all choose the topics. So we're not going to meet on February 20th or February 27th. Not even through these kind of video lectures or Zoom. Okay, and then I think what's going to happen is I think they're going to add court classes in May. But we'll see, okay? So during that time, then I'll put everything together and we'll have a set syllabus, okay? And we should also have the assessments by then. So between now and February 13th, we need to decide what we're going to study and how we're going to assess, okay? So let's look at the kind of possibilities for we can study. All right, so I think so. One was this idea of sexism in Hollywood, okay? So and I'm just going to write it out here. So it's just a little easier, okay? And please read through these as well. So instead of, okay, we can talk about sexism in Hollywood, but as a more general topic, okay? And, okay, this is me using my kind of authoritative power, but I'm going to generalize it a little bit more so that it's easier for me to think of it as a sort of topic to teach, right? But we can talk about kind of gender dynamics in movies, okay, and representation. So that gives us more kind of room, right? We can talk about the Me Too movement, we can talk about Harvey Weinstein, but we can also talk about the way that gender has been represented in Hollywood films, dragon, the dragon or the butterfly, when it comes to representations of Asian women. And I have a lot of readings, and because that's a big part of my research as well. So, that's something we can talk about, okay? So, we can change this to think about as like gender and cinema, okay? And we can just do a short topic on that, all right? So, I need you to kind of, and we can talk about it in class, in the forums, okay? Or if we did a Zoom, we could talk about it there as well, okay? Another thing is, and then one of the assessments, right, is short essays and a final presentation. Okay, 2 short essays and a final presentation. All right, so next is Samuel said we can talk about radical feminist movements in Asia. Radical feminists. Okay, so when Samuel's saying is against. Okay, so radical feminist movements in Asia. Okay, so this would end kind of like against second wave or critical of second wave. Okay. Feminism. So obviously we talk about these different waves of feminism, and second wave liberalism. Okay, I'm just going like that. Okay, and Samuel, if I'm for all of you, if I'm phrasing any of these incorrectly, just let me know. Okay, so I'm just kind of creating the kind of categories right now, right? And another thing that people talk about this too is women of color feminism. But, it's different to say a radical feminist movement in Asia versus women of color feminism, so we can talk about that later. Okay. Back to the topic form. Okay. And there's a lot here, so really I appreciate this. Gendered violence. Okay. Responses to gendered violence. Okay, let's say how Asian cars. Okay, let's say a law. Let's talk about this as law. Okay, I think that'd be easier. Okay. Legal laws on sexual violence in Asia. Okay, all right, and that is a very interesting topic. Okay, all right. and the legal system, like Samuel's saying here, is very much linked to colonial apparatuses. Okay, so it's important to talk about that. All right, what's next? Okay, Asian masculinity. All right, I have a lot on that. So if you want to talk about masculinity and how it's different in Asia versus how it's different in different places and what shapes that. Okay, there's quite a bit to talk about that. Just double check. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We can talk about this if you want. All right. So, like I said, we're gonna poll on this. All right. Okay. Okay. Back to the poll. To the form. Okay. And oh wait, I clicked the wrong one. Sorry. Maybe I should have done this before recording, but sorry. Hopefully you're looking through this at the same time that I am too. That would be good. But this is part of the why I want to do this is, well, okay. My computer's freezing. Okay, I should have written this all out first. Okay. All right, I lost access. Okay. All right, so I guess what I'm going to do is I will, okay, just from my memory, okay, some of the other topics people, why did I, okay, this is the wrong place anyway. Okay, I was thinking that I would copy these over for you later on, but, other things people want to talk about is pre-colonial conceptions of gender. I remember that was one of them. Oh, here we go. Okay. Hong Kong gender relations in Hong Kong. Okay, I'm gonna keep it a bit more open-ended just to make it easier. Okay, comparative. I think it's comparative colonial legacies. I think that's what it's saying. So, comparisons of colonial legacies regarding gender. And like I said, any mistakes I make, just clarify. Okay, in comments. Okay. I'm not sure what this means. Hi, Delia. Okay. And so I think this goes into this one, right? And is it possible? Okay. And I think that's an important question, right? Like, what does the term gender even mean? Can you have an idea of what is gender without a colonial institution? Okay. So I think this is definitely one that we need to cover. But at the same time, that's kind of still up to you, okay? So please take a look at that, and if you're really interested in something, talk more about it, okay? Let's see, okay, stigma on sex, that's interesting too, okay? Stigma on sex workers in Hong Kong. Okay, let's just talk about sex work, okay? Sex work is a really important thing to talk about, okay? So we can call it sex work or gendered labor if we want, okay? I don't know. Yeah. All right. And Islam and feminism, Chinese collectivism and feminism. Okay. So we can talk about this in terms of, I mean, we can say Islam and feminism, or, I think Lewis here is calling it Chinese collectivism. I don't know if that's keyword for Confucianism and feminism. Okay. But, we can talk about these kind of, cultural and religious traditions that are not, okay, we can't say that they're not colonial, right? Because Islam can also be seen as a colonizing force. So obviously Confucianism and Chinese collectivism. But the relationship between these and feminism, I think is important to understand. Okay, so that's quite an interesting thing to talk about too. Sex workers. Okay, so this is an ask by Ebi. Is Ebi? Okay. Research essay, book review, case study, and class participation. Okay, so we'll put that in the, yeah. Okay, just cut this down a little. Research essay. So look at the details lists later. Okay, and a film review, book review, or film review, or personal reflection, case study as a presentation. Okay. And class participation. So these are coming across as quite conventional, which is not necessarily a bad thing. If you think that that's the best way you learn, that's cool. That's good. Okay, creative process, creative project. Okay, creative project, and also Zoom. And we have a poll on that. All right, so let's leave that for now because we don't know for sure whether or not we're actually going to be able to meet. Okay, sexual discourse among disempowered women in Hong Kong. So so that's interesting. Okay, this is Rosette. Okay, Rosette has two things to say. Two topics. Okay. Okay, so what we can call this is, I'll use a new term. Okay, but I'm gonna use the word subaltern. Okay, subaltern voices. Okay, or can subaltern actually speak, or minorities? You know, minority. Gender and minorities. Gendered minorities? No. Okay, let's just use the word subaltern for now. Okay, in Hong Kong. Okay, and then another one is kind of contradictions in Hong Kong regarding democracy and ethnic minorities. So if you look at what Rosette's saying is, how people in Hong Kong can be very undemocratic about things like gender and sexuality while upholding and endorsing democracy. Okay, so let's put the word sexuality there too. Regarding democracy, contradictions in Hong Kong democracy and discrimination. Okay, this kind of double standard. Okay, let's see if I can come up with a better term for that later. Right, but that's an interesting topic as well. Okay. Discourse among disempowered. Okay, so the word I'm using instead of disempowered is subaltern. Okay, before colonization. So this goes back to what Adela was saying. Okay, so we'll consider that to be the same topic. Okay, and okay, I lost it again. All right. So these are the categories we have now, but the polls are still open for more categories. Okay, and then obviously I would expect that you would have more things to talk about, or more things you want to talk about after this lecture. So take a look and think about it a little more after you watch this lecture. Okay. If I missed anything, I'll add it. Okay. So I think I asked all of you to participate on this idea of decolonizing the classroom by February 6th, but I'm going to change that. Okay, let's see. And 2 research essays and participation. Okay, and let's see. I like research most. I personally prefer doing research papers and tests. Okay. Okay, so thank you, Alice, for giving reasons for. Okay. Okay, cool. All right. So yeah. So let's okay, so that's on the board already. So it seems like a lot of people want to do Moodle participation and research essays, but let's see how effective that is. Okay, I still need all of you to participate. All right, so some changes then. All right, so let's keep going like this for now. Please vote on whether or not you want to use Zoom. Okay. Those are the topics we have now, but the polls are still open. I want you to participate in this, okay? I still want you to have time to listen to this lecture. So let's say that you participate by, let's say by Sunday evening, okay? Oh, what did I do? Okay, participate by Sunday evening, okay? And let's do the same for this idea of decolonizing the classroom. Okay. Okay. And I think this one it's kind of hard to say much, right? Because I'm covering a lot of this questions of decolonizing, but maybe ask other questions. Okay. So think about what other ways can we discuss this. Okay. So thanks, Abby and Adela. I think that there's a lot more we can do, but maybe ask more questions, or think about, speculate. Like, have your other classes been able to decolonize? Are there good things about colonialism? Like, come up with questions. See if you can kind of work on your ability and increase your power, okay, to develop discussion, right? So it doesn't have to answer my question, just generally on this topic of decolonizing the classroom, okay, or its relationship to gender, right? Okay, all right. So that's it for now. Please post, and also you can post questions. Okay, that's really important. I want you to post questions, kind of, and I'm gonna move this up to right below. Okay, so this is supposed to be a response area to this lecture. So if you have any questions about this lecture, that also counts as participation. Okay, all right. So I'm gonna post this lecture now, and I hope to hear from you in the forums, and we'll talk more. Okay, and then after everyone's got their kind of nominations in, I will kind of create the poll, and I'll look at the schedule and how much time we have to cover what things and what I'm able to cover. Okay, so post and talk, amongst yourselves. I will moderate so we can figure out what's the best way to go about this. Okay, all right. That's it for today. All right, I'm gonna turn this off, and I will see you soon. Okay, bye.